Welcome to The Explainer. You know that sinking feeling, right? When something small happens and your mind just instantly leaps to the absolute worst-case scenario? Well, it turns out there's a really good reason for that. Today, we're going to dig into your brain's built-in glitch, why we're all kind of hardwired for negativity, and what we can actually do about it.
All right, so here's what we've got on tap. We're going to talk about that worst-case scenario brain. Then we'll get into why it's all about survival over truth. We'll look at the amygdala's alarm system. That's the hardware. Then we'll see how our brain's threat goggles change how we see the world. And finally, the most important part, working with your wiring.
All right, first up, the worst-case scenario brain. Let's talk about why your mind is just primed for negative outcomes. I mean, we've all been there, right? That feeling when your brain hits fast forward and goes straight to the worst possible ending. So why does our brain do this? Why does it expect the worst? Well, the first thing to know is this isn't some kind of personal flaw. You're not just a pessimist. It's actually a fundamental feature of our brain's operating system. It's a real, well-documented thing that scientists call the negativity bias.
Basically, our brains are just wired to pay way more attention to, focus on, and remember the bad stuff. Think about it this way. Positive experiences are kind of like Teflon. They just slide right off. But negative experiences, they're like Velcro. They stick. And as a lot of research in cognitive behavioral therapy shows, this can get us stuck in these nasty loops of stress and anxiety.
So this brings us to a really key point, survival over truth. This whole thing, this negative bent, it's not a mistake. It's an ancient survival mechanism.
You see, our brains didn't evolve to make us happy, or even to be right all the time. Nope. They evolved for one thing, survival. And that led to something called an adaptive bias. This just means our brain is way more concerned with reducing the cost of being wrong than just reducing the number of times it's wrong. Big difference. And this is where something called error management theory comes in. It's actually pretty simple. When we're not sure about something, our brain can make two kinds of mistakes. There's a false positive, that's a type 1 error, where you think there's a risk, but there isn't. And then there's a false negative, a type 2 error, where you failed to see a risk that's actually there.
And this quote really nails it. Where a false positive is much less costly than a false negative, it makes sense to bias the system. Because let's be real, the cost of these two mistakes is almost never the same, not even close.
The best way to think about this is a smoke detector, right? A false positive is when it goes off because you're cooking bacon. Super annoying, low cost. But a false negative, that's when it fails to go off during a real fire. The cost is catastrophic. Our brain is exactly like that oversensitive smoke detector. For our ancestors hearing a rustle in the grass and thinking saber-toothed tiger when it was just the wind, well, that's a false positive. You just look a little jumpy. But thinking, oh, it's just the wind when it was a saber-toothed tiger, that's a false negative. Game over. So yeah, our brains learn to be jumpy.
Okay, so let's get into the hardware. How does this whole system actually work? Let's meet the brain's rapid response security guard, the amygdala's alarm system.
So here's the brain's threat pathway, and it is lightning fast. First, you get some sensory input. You see something, hear something. That signal goes straight to the amygdala, which instantly, and I mean instantly, slaps a label on it, threat or no threat. And if it decides threat, it triggers that whole fight or flight response all over your body before you've even had a chance to consciously think about what's happening.
So let's go back to that analogy. The amygdala, that's your smoke detector. The one that's super sensitive and just starts screaming at the slightest hint of trouble. But then you have your prefrontal cortex. That's the more rational, thinking part of your brain. It's like the fire department dispatcher. It gets the alarm call from the amygdala and has to figure out, okay, hold on, is this a real fire or did somebody just burn some toast?
So what happens when you take this ancient alarm system and drop it into our modern world? Well, you get what we're calling our brain's threat goggles. Let's look at how this ancient bias shapes everything today.
Okay, this next part is wild. Back in 2006, the satirical newspaper The Onion ran a story as a joke. It was about something they called pre-traumatic stress, describing soldiers who were having flash forwards of terrible things that might happen to them. It was total satire, or so they thought.
Well, it turns out the joke was on all of us because pre-traumatic stress reactions are a real thing. Seriously. Researchers studying soldiers found that these future-oriented intrusive thoughts, basically vividly imagining terrible things that haven't happened yet, are a genuine aspect of trauma. In fact, they found that how much a soldier worried about these future events actually helped predict who would later develop PTSD. So yeah, art or satire became reality.
Okay, so if our brains can create trauma from things that haven't even happened, what else is this bias doing? Well, some research suggests it might even have a link to something as complex as our political orientation.
Take a look at this 2022 study. Researchers found that at a baseline, conservative participants tended to interpret ambiguous faces as more threatening than liberal participants did. But then they did something fascinating. They gave the liberal participants a mentally draining task, basically using up their cognitive resources. And when they were tired out, their negativity bias increased to levels pretty similar to the conservatives. What this suggests is that our brain's default setting might be threat, and it takes real mental effort from that prefrontal cortex to override it.
So, this all leads to the big question. What the heck do we do about it? Right? We can't change the hardware, but we absolutely can update the software. Let's talk about working with your wiring.
The very first step is just noticing. We have to learn to spot these common glitches in our thinking, what are often called cognitive distortions. Things like all-or-nothing thinking, where if it's not perfect, it's a total failure, or catastrophizing, where you blow things way out of proportion, or my personal favorite, fortune-telling, where you just predict the future is going to be awful with zero actual evidence.
And there's actually a really powerful technique from cognitive behavioral therapy to help with this. It's called the ABCD model. It's a 4-step plan to restructure your thoughts. A is for the activating event. What happened? B is for your beliefs. What's that automatic negative thought that popped up? C is for the consequences. How did that thought make you feel and act? And then, the most important part, D, for dispute. This is where you challenge that thought. You ask, wait a minute, is that really true? Is it helping me? What's a more balanced way of looking at this?
So at the end of the day, just knowing this stuff, knowing about your brain's ancient bias is huge. It means you're not just a victim of it anymore. You have the power to hit pause when that internal alarm starts blaring, to actually ask yourself if you're dealing with a real fire or just some burnt toast, and to choose how you respond instead of just reacting. That built-in glitch, it's really a feature, not a bug. So the only question is, now that you know, how will you respond differently?